Hello, everybody. My name's Karen. I'm the Family and Local History Librarian at the Plaza Library, and this is being recorded, as you heard, so please leave your mics and cameras off. So I'd like to do the welcome. So, Wyndham City Council recognises the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people as the first custodians of the lands on which Australia was founded. Council acknowledges the Wathaurong, Woiwurrung and Boonwurrung people of the Kulin Nation as the traditional owners of the lands on which Wyndham City is being built. Council pays respect to the wisdom and diversity of the past and present elders. We share commitment to nurture future generations of elders in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities. Today's talk is in partnership with Melbourne Water. It's in place of our normal local history bus tours that we usually run in November. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce our guest speakers today, Paul Balassoni and Austin Graham from Melbourne Water, and they'll be available for Q&A at the end of this talk. Paul, can you share your screen, please?
Shall do. Okay then. Well, thank you, Karen and Micah. Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us. As Karen said at the introduction, I'm Paul Balassoni, and I'm joined by my colleague Austin Graham. We're from the heritage team at Melbourne Water, so it gives us great pleasure to be able to share this time with you. And as Karen just mentioned, ordinarily we'd be doing a bus tour this time of the year. But in a COVID world, it's good to see us rise to the occasion and adapt accordingly. So once again, we're grateful to Karen for suggesting we do this presentation a few weeks ago. So perhaps think of it as an incursion, us coming to you in the comfort of your space. So this will be somewhat of a tag team effort between Austin and myself. So, we hope to provide you with a bit of an insight into the many aspects of the Western Treatment Plant to help build a better understanding and appreciation for what is a relatively complex landscape. Now, I guess in some ways, the system that we've come to take for granted pretty much had to be built from scratch. So through this potted history, we hope to set some historical and operational context to the role of the sewage system, as indeed the Western Treatment Plant, in shaping the formative years of Melbourne in what we've really become a modern metropolis. And above all, we pretty much hope to whet your appetite so that you come and see us in due course. So by way of introduction, perhaps a bit of an overview of the operational context to the Western Treatment Plant before we get into the history. So it is a relatively vast site covering just short of, or occupying rather, short of 11,000 hectares. And it does include sophisticated plants and machinery to treat sewage, supply recycled water, and also power generation. So it's come a long way in its 120 plus years of service. Its operations are pretty much down to three core functions. Sewage treatment and water recycling go pretty much hand in hand. Some of you may not even know, but there is a livestock and agricultural business that's pretty much been in operation since day one. In fact, actually, if not even earlier, before sewage started flowing onto the plants. And then you've got your conservation areas with Melbourne Water needing to fulfill a number of regulatory processes in terms of managing the biodiversity at the plant. From a functionality point of view, the Western Treatment Plant treats over 500 million litres per day. It services 2 million households through the retail water companies. And pretty much in terms of timeline, we're looking at pretty much 25 to 30 days of treatment from the moment sewage enters the plant and exits into the Port Phillip Bay. So as a bit of an overview, we are the wholesale water company. So in the context of sewage, we treat bulk sewage which we receive through the retail companies being City West Water out in the west, Yarra Valley Water and Southeast Water. I use the analogy of the road network, where our infrastructure pretty much is very similar to the highways or the freeways of the road network. And then the retail water companies they manage the minor streets and so forth that basically lead people to the households. So that's us as a visual. And then as a bit of a summary, our network pretty much comprises of two major treatment plants, one at the Western Treatment Plant, the other Eastern Treatment Plant, two vastly different systems. The Western being largely natural process, and hence by its very nature and history, very land intensive. It's with the modern lagoons, and the Eastern Treatment Plant is very contained. It's all mechanized. It's so it's a different process altogether. Although we may only have 400 kilometres of sewers, the retailers each have tens of thousands of kilometres of sewers. Our sewers are quite large. They're anything up to 4 metres plus in diameter, and anywhere near 75 to 100 metres below ground. So we are pretty much the backbone of the system. And just another visual, something that we like to be playful with, and that's just by way of comparison. We are slightly larger than Phillip Island in size, and another fact is that it is the largest land-based, or by land mass anyways, the largest sewage treatment facility in the world. So not by volume, by all means, but certainly by land mass we are, and that's officially recognised. And what I've circled is just a bit of a reminder that that is the Riverwalk Estate. So something to think about as we go through the presentation is, who would have ever imagined a housing development at the doorstep of the Western Treatment Plant? Just really goes to show how it's basically evolved over time. So, so over our 130-year journey, we've gone from public health is my reward, which was the original motto of the MMBW at the time, through to today's vision of enhancing life and livability. Pretty much the focus has been the same: public health, and also these days the health of the environment. And pretty much it goes to acknowledge the important role that our assets and services play in the lives of our customers and the health of the environment, and the whole notion of livability. Over this time, however, look, our view of, as indeed our relationship with the Western Treatment Plant, originally named the Metropolitan Farm, and the so-called backbone of the system, it has truly evolved both within the business but also external. So hopefully today's presentation will dispel a few myths and perhaps even, as mentioned earlier, encourage you to come and visit the site. So, for all the grandeur that was marvellous Melbourne in the 1880s on the back of the gold rush, the city was nicknamed Smellbourne, and pretty much for good reason. Despite being one of the richest cities in the world, by the 1880s, we were pretty much figuratively and literally drowning in our waste and in a tight grip of a typhoid cholera epidemic. So in the early days of settlement, most wastewater from houses and businesses would simply drain into street channels formed at either side of most streets, which were usually lined with bluestone pictures as per the attached photograph. Usually bridges or gratings would span the drains to allow pedestrians safely, and you can probably barely make them out in that photo. So most street channels never went underground. They discharged instead into nearby watercourses and in turn into the Yarra. So ironically, it wasn't long before or long after settlement, the natural watercourses, soon became drains and sewers as much as the source of drinking water, until the Yan Yan system came along in 1857. And as most of us could only imagine, the early system was pretty primitive, to say the least. Some people buried their refuse in backyards, or allowed it to simply drain away and seep into the soil. One advancement was the pit toilet, which was nothing more than just basically a hole in the ground, glorified with somewhat of a seat over the hole to provide some comfort, but perhaps also to provide a bit of a seal to avoid flies and whatnot. By way of reality check in 2020, it's still commonplace in most third world countries to come across these pit toilets. Then came along the ubiquitous Thunderbox, commonplace in most Aussie backyards, and I'm sure some of us have seen, if not used one of these over our time. So whether a Thunderbox or a proper bricked structure that would be built as far as possible from the house for practical reasons, but also for another reason that the pans could be within easy access for the nightman, a role which I'll touch on shortly. If you actually happen to walk down many of the small laneways in the CBD today or in a suburb such as Fitzroy, Collingwood, you will note the bricked up openings that once were access to the night soil pans. So prior to the advent of the MMBW, as indeed the sewage system, it was common for cesspits to be emptied by contractors who carted the contents to a manure depot, eventually for use as fertilizer. Alternatively, the pits were abandoned and others simply dug. So once again, as a bit of a reminder, human waste is still used as a fertilizer in some parts of the world. So by the 1880s, Melbourne was certainly in the tight grip of a cholera typhoid epidemic, which prompted a change, and it was a bit of a turning point that we haven't looked back since. So the first step was the Royal Commission into the Royal Sanitary Commission, rather, in 1888, which led to the establishment of our predecessor, the Board of Works. The mandate was clear to build a much needed sewage system, as well at the time to manage the water supply system. This authority was essentially modelled on a Metropolitan Board of Works based in London, and not surprising. As you can see in the photo in the centre there, the nature of the board was such that it comprised one representative from each of the 39 councils at the time. So some of us will remember the city of Fitzroy, the city of Collingwood, and a whole host of small councils, unlike what we see today. So each of these members, each bearing the title commissioners, and that structure still survived right up until 1992, when the MMBW merged with a number of water authorities and trusts to become corporatised and formed Melbourne Water. Now, the MMBW, as I said earlier, was assigned the responsibility for both water supply and treatment of sewage. So bearing in mind, the MMBW inherited both the Yanyi water supply system, completed in 1857, and at the time, the Watts River scheme, which had completed just about a month before the board came into effect. And the Watts River scheme was later to be called the Maroondah water supply system. So our history as an organisation goes back long before 1891. So as a priority, the MMBW engaged, I'll go back a step. So as a priority, the MMBW engaged an English consultant, James Mansur. He proposed a scheme with dual sewage treatment plants, one at Werribee, one at Mordialloc. However, a single scheme at Werribee was adopted based on the cost of land, not to mention the political backlash at the suggestion of a sewage plant near the affluent Bayside suburbs. Now, the original site proposed by Mansur at Werribee was actually, in fact, on the east side of the river, today occupied predominantly by the market gardens, but land to the west was chosen instead, as it was larger and would cater more adequately for the sewage disposal needs of a growing population. The board's chief engineer, William Thwaites, quite an eminent engineer in his own right, had considerable influence over the alteration of these plans, and pretty much he had the final say once James Mansur had left and done his job. So this is a somewhat of a pictorial overview of the early the network. So construction of the early system was characterised by, as you can imagine, frenetic activity across inner metropolitan Melbourne, from Collingwood to the east, Fitzroy to the north, Richmond to the south, and the city, and all the way down to Werribee. So some form of works was happening right across the city. The scheme was an engineering marvel for not only its scale as indeed integrated approach. Remember, it wasn't only dealing with conveyance of sewage. It wasn't only taking sewage away. It was, unlike most systems in the world at the time, it was actually treating the sewage at the same time, not just simply dumping it into local waterways or indeed the bay. So unlike many systems elsewhere across the world, it was fully integrated. At the time, it was one of the largest public works projects in Australia and certainly one of the largest on a global perspective. At a social level, apart from public health, the construction of the system also came at a great time, with the scheme providing employment opportunities for the many that would otherwise be unemployed due to the depression of the 1880s or 1890s rather. The system will continue to be expanded over the decades. In recent years, we've come to renew many of the early sewers. The system pretty much from the turning of the first sod comprised of four main components: the reticulation system, which was the sewers, which we call the sewers that basically start from the household, within the household, then into the street, and then eventually joining the network of underground sewers. You had the Spotswood pumping station, so everything from Melbourne gravitated all the way down to Spotswood pumping station. From there, it was pumped all the way up to present day Millers Road in Brooklyn, which marked the start of the main outfall sewer, and then from there it continued on 27 kilometres down to the Western Treatment Plant. So in a basic form, that was the whole network described, and all built over pretty much a 5-year span. And of course, decades on, it just continued to develop accordingly. Now, the first city sewers in what was, I guess, it's always important to try and put things in perspective by understanding what was happening elsewhere at the time. So, sure, Europe had long had built sewers, but honestly, in terms of systems, it wasn't integrated. It certainly advanced. It took sewage away from the streets, but it's merely dumped them often in waterways, which was the source of their water. So, and even in our own backyard with Sydney. So the first city sewers in Sydney were constructed as early as the 1850s, but they simply discharged raw sewage directly into the harbour. In fact, by 1875, there were quite a number of sewage outlets at different locations in the harbour, each, as you can only imagine, causing a nuisance. So the Melbourne system incorporated many learnings back, I guess, from England, as indeed Sydney and elsewhere in the world. So that's the beauty of being such a young nation. We can always learn from others' mistakes. And so this resulting in the construction of a system that was truly a grand vision, not only dealing with conveyance of sewage away from the city, but also dealing with treatment, hence the creation of the Western Treatment Plant. Now, in true Australian folklore, the first place to be sewered was a place of great worship, and it wasn't a church either. It was a hotel. So the All England 11 Hotel, formerly at the corner of Rouse and Princess Streets, Port Melbourne, was the first property to be connected. Sadly, it no longer survives, but at least there is a plaque at the corner of the building. So finally, we land at the Western Treatment Plant. Now, the land occupied by the Western Treatment Plant is the traditional country of the Wadawurrung people. And so Austin will touch on this more, but suffice to say, it is an important layer in our history as a business that we acknowledge today. And Werribee was simply chosen for the low-lying volcanic plains coupled with low rainfall, which made it suitable for land-based treatment, not to mention cheap and considerable distance from Melbourne. So the original scheme, as proposed by James Mansur, did involve two treatment plants, the Yada in Mordialloc and also being situated so close to the affluent Bayside suburbs, the proposal, clearly succumbed to political pressure brought about by the influential constituents living in the Bayside suburbs of Brighton, etc. Look, as a side note, however, it wasn't until early 1940s when the Braeside treatment plant, now Braeside Park, would be built to service the inner southeastern suburbs, later to be replaced by the current day Eastern Treatment Plant, which was built in 1975. So it is important to also understand what was happening elsewhere in Victoria, and I touched on the PAN system, the funder box, septic tanks. Those systems were well and truly still in place by almost the late 80s, early 90s in some of the southeastern suburbs for that reason. So much of the land occupied by the Western Treatment Plant was actually purchased from the Chirnside estate, and many of you will know of the Werribee Mansion fame. The Western Treatment Plant, as indicated by the first little box there, was meticulously planned with land allocated to a number of functions, all of which were related or at least supported the core function of sewage treatment. The first property to be sewered was in 1897. So for the first few years of setting up the Western Treatment Plant, the farm was actually supporting tenant farming. So the board wasted no time until the system came along to make use of the land. So it leased a lot of land off to for tenant farming, and apart from the initial purchase from the Chirnside estate in 1891, the acquisition of land continued right through to the 1940s. As expected, as the system was growing, the population was growing. The plant obviously had to increase its capacity. Okay, so now down to actual treatment and the operations. So the first sewage treatment method used at the farm was land filtration. Once sewage reached the farm from Melbourne via the main outfall sewer, the sewage was conveyed through the system of distribution channels or carriers, as they were called, all over the farm. The sewage filtered through 20-acre blocks and using gravity, nothing more than gravity. So from the high side to the low side. And the method of flooding, very similar to irrigation, normal farming irrigation. The process takes place entirely underground with the sewage percolating through the soil. So this method was restricted to the warmer months between October and April, with high evaporation, low rainfall, rapid grass growth, and infiltration capacity of the soil at its peak. And once again, to emphasize the ingenuity of the business model, where the cost of operation was offset by farming operation. And you can see that as the grass was growing, that's when they would graze the cattle and the sheep. At its height, we had tens of thousands of heads of cattle and sheep on the farm. And to this day, it remains one of the largest farming operations in Victoria. So this is just a pictorial view of the grid-like layout that characterizes the farm. So each of the paddocks are bordered by carriers and sub-carriers, and nothing more than just flooding. And it's just a case of just instead of using water, using raw sewage to do the work. So a very smart business model. So in 1926, there was a bit of a change. So the land filtration was pretty much ideal for summer. Now, to increase capacity, we had to think of something for the winter months. So grass filtration was introduced and adopted by the 1930s as a main winter treatment method. So very similar to land filtration in layout and preparation, and best suited for the winter months between May and September, because otherwise the soil was too wet for land filtration. So sewage would be continuously passed at a slow rate over grassed areas planted with specifically designed Italian ryegrass, which is fine stemmed and thick in growth, creating a nice natural filter. So as it would trickle through the grass, suspended matter would be filtered out, and pollutants in the water were removed by a film of bacteria present on the grass and in the soil. So at the end of the bay, the filtered sewage would simply flow into urban drains, which took the treated effluent to Port Phillip Bay. Yet again, in the 1930s, just to show how the plant was continuously evolving and brought about by all understanding of science, etc. So in the 1930s, the MMBW experimented with lagooning to further increase capacity and ensure reliability of the plant. And it started by using a natural swamp named Lake Borry after one of the chief engineers. So once again, entirely a natural process using bacteria. And in the 1990s, we continued to further develop and refine the lagooning process. And in the 1990s, there was a bit of a turning point for the Western Treatment Plant. So there was a landmark 4-year Port Phillip Bay environmental study that identified the risk of too much nitrogen going into the bay. And so that prompted a $124 million upgrade at the time of the whole lagoon system to ensure the long-term health of the Port Phillip Bay. And enhancing the modern lagoon system as we know it today reduces the amount of nitrogen in effluent treated at the plant and in turn flown into the bay. And a key outcome of the upgrade is now an abundant supply of high quality recycled water that can be used for agricultural, horticultural, and many other applications. The upgrade is also creating opportunities for biosolids, recycling, renewable energy generation, and the new agricultural land. So as you can see, it's a long way from just the simple poo farm that's come along the way. And renewable energy. So pretty much the Western Treatment Plant has become self-sufficient in terms of its power needs, and this is largely through the trapping of methane gas on one of the first ponds, and we have an energy plant on site that turns the gas into electricity, and so once again a unique model. Pretty much all are offset by the farming and now also energy generation. And once again, recycled water is yet another product. So there are two classes, without getting into too much detail, there are two classes of recycled water that we produce. Effectively, the treated sewage these days through the lagooning system, that goes, some of which goes into the bay, but most of which is actually used on site for irrigation of the paddocks to support the farming operations. So quite a symbiotic type of relationship. It is called Class C. So that is great for farming, for grazing and whatnot, not for food production. So all the crops that are used or that are grown at the Western Treatment Plant only goes for animal fodder. All right, and then the Class C, there's an amount of Class C that goes through further refinement and treatment to produce Class A recycled water, and that's on-sold to the retail water company for use by councils for their sports ovals and for new house subdivisions, new housing development, the third pipeline. So once again, it's a great byproduct. If you can make out those white patches on the ponds there, they're the covers, and so they trap all the methane gas. And to the top of that image with the 4 round circles on the top there, that's the power plant. Now, it was going back to history again. It was land intensive, and it also had to be labor intensive. The whole farming operations. Remember, Werribee, it was nothing more than a little fledgling settlement, not much there. So the border works. If it had to bring on people, it really had to, I guess, support the people in many ways. One being housing. So not too dissimilar to the rest of the border works. It was almost typical of a resident workforce right across the border works, whether it was the water supply catchments, or in this case, the Werribee sewage farm. Much of the operations was characterised by a resident workforce. And at the farm, by 1915, as early as 1915, the farm's workforce had increased to 171 people. There were already cottages from the early days of operation, 1895. And you can see just those two images, just to show you that you had the workers' cottage up the top left-hand corner, bottom right. Was the farm manager, so you can sort of see that divide. But in terms of workforce, you can see, so by 1915 it had gone pretty much up to 171, and that would have been fairly high at the time. Then mechanisation also reduced the workforce from its peak of 508 in 1951 to 347 in 1960. And as that note down the bottom, and between by the 1980s, the numbers were between 320 and 350. So you can start imagining there's now a layer of what we call community life that was developing on the farm. This is just some of the photographs in our archives of typical residences, where people did live. Was pretty much streetscaped. It was almost, looking at those houses, you could be mistaken to be in suburbia somewhere. And in true sort of in terms of supporting a community life, the border works ensured that there was schooling, and often was actually the community themselves that often canvassed, campaigned for amenities such as schools. So the first school opened up in 1895, soon after the plant had sort of started operating. And as you can see, over time, 4 schools in total were established on the farm. And locally, I think the Girl Guides Hall in College Road, I believe, in Werribee, is actually the one photographed in the bottom right-hand corner there. Once again, community life. It was one thing for the border works to provide amenities. It was another thing for the community actually to build a community, and there was such a strong community spirit that they got into everything. So at Cockrock, Cockrock, pretty much Cockrock North, which was the main community hub, the main town centre. So by the 1940s, the main town of Cockrock had its own swimming pool, sports pavilion, a pool, tennis court, church, post office, you name it. It had a lot of facilities that you would otherwise associate with a small country town. Which really brings me to an exciting aspect of, I guess, of community life, but also a development at the Western Treatment Plants. And we were fortunate enough to have a former colleague by way of Monica Schott, who used to work at the Werribee Treatment Plant. She recently completed a PhD research into community life at Cockrock. And I encourage you all to visit the website, and And in the photo with Monica down the bottom, she's on the left, but the other people are former residents. They were children at the time, and they've through Monica's project, they've rallied and set up a I think it's the Friends of Metropolitan Sewage Farm Friends Group, which goes to show, I guess, the level of connection and connectedness amongst the former employees and residents. And it's very typical of the Border Works history, I guess, because we've got those connections elsewhere across the system with water supply, etc. So another aspect is biodiversity. I mentioned, conservation is a key aspect of the Western Treatment Plant. It was declared a wildlife sanctuary back in as early as 1923 as part of that Bellarine Peninsula foreshore. Second to Kakadu in the number of bird species. It's a world-renowned wetland. We've got migratory species. It is part of a Ramsar wetland, the Western Treatment Plant. It basically supports significant reptiles, amphibians, and mammals, and just a whole range of habitats. So you can, once again, these are all these layers that would otherwise not be known by most people. As I mentioned earlier, agriculture, part and parcel of the whole sewage treatment in the early days, but to this day, it stands on its own. Although we've moved away from the cattle and sheeping on large scale, these days the emphasis is on cropping, and probably, I think, if I'm not mistaken, it was about 10 years ago when the actual farming operations was outsourced by Melbourne Water. So it's actually managed by a company under a lease arrangement. Another interesting aspect that I'll just touch on briefly is what I call the defence era. So it was during the 1940s, the Commonwealth government compulsorily acquired land from the then Border Works for the purpose of establishing a satellite aerodrome at the time to support, I guess, the war campaign. After the United States entered the war in December 1941, additional accommodation was needed for aircraft and personnel. So once again, from the initial acquisition of land, further land was acquired in 1942. And the remnants of that era stands by way of the aircraft hangars. Most of you being perhaps locals might know of the aircraft hangars. Well, only 2 survive out of the total of 5. And just scattered, I guess, across the landscape as a, I guess, a remnant or a relic of that era is at the top is the defence pillbox, just indiscriminately just located down close to the foreshore. But once again, it just goes to highlight the so many layers that pretty much make up this landscape. So look, without further ado, at this point, I'm now going to hand over to Austin. So
Thanks, Paul.
Austin, just tell me when you're ready to change slides.
Yep, no worries, we'll do. Thank you for that. That's it's always such interesting history to hear. So I work with Paul in the Little Heritage. Him and myself comprise the heritage team at Melbourne Water, and Paul's touched on Western Treatment Plant and just the myriad of heritage values that it has there, and the image that you have just seen, it just demonstrates the vast array of cultural heritage assets that we have to manage across Melbourne Water, both Aboriginal cultural heritage and historical heritage. So I'll quickly touch on Aboriginal cultural heritage management and how Paul and I manage that within Melbourne Water. So we not only have a legislative obligation to protect Aboriginal cultural heritage places, as prescribed by the Aboriginal Heritage Act, which you can see up there, and also the Aboriginal Heritage Regulations. They outline our legislative obligations for protecting the values of Aboriginal cultural heritage. So we not only have the legislative obligation, but we also have just a social obligation, because it is such a valued and sensitive cultural aspect, and it's not only valued within Melbourne Water but outside of Melbourne Water. Paul, you can go to the next slide. So with managing the Aboriginal cultural heritage assets within the Melbourne Water landscape, we also have to consult with traditional owners in Aboriginal Victoria to make sure that we are able to protect these values. And there's just a little map up on the screen there, and it shows the government prescribed boundaries of the registered Aboriginal parties in the different colours. There's also white areas there, which are non-RAP areas, non-registered Aboriginal party areas, and these are contested lands and they haven't been allocated a registered Aboriginal party. So the governing body in those white areas is Aboriginal Victoria. So you can see Melbourne CBD is a non-RAP area, but most of Western Treatment Plant is in Wadawurrung country. So we consult with Wadawurrung when cultural heritage assets within Western Treatment Plant are in question. Thanks, Paul. There's just a little map up on the screen here as well. It's a publicly accessible map, and it's from a database that Paul and I deal with every day through our management, and it allows us to see listed Aboriginal places, so registered Aboriginal places and sites, but also areas of sensitivity. And you can see Western Treatment Plant down in the corner there is just the entire site is an area of Aboriginal cultural heritage sensitivity because of its wetland, Ramsar wetland status. So the entire of Western Treatment Plant, we have to treat with sensitivity around Aboriginal cultural heritage. And it's great because it just demonstrates the variety of values that Western Treatment Plant has. It's so significant with all the different kinds of values, cultural values, social and historic values that it has. Thanks, Paul. There's just as I should have mentioned before, not only stone artefact sites that we manage, Aboriginal stone artefact sites that we manage across Melbourne Water, but there's a myriad of Aboriginal cultural heritage places, including scarred trees, earth mounds, stone artefact scatters that you can see, and culturally significant places such as meeting places and burial grounds. There's just a couple of images up on the screen of recent artefacts that we've come across, and it's more likely that we've come across artefacts across every single part of Melbourne Water delivery and service area. They're just artefacts absolutely everywhere, which demonstrates that Aboriginal cultural heritage is everywhere across not only Victoria and Western Treatment Plant, but the entirety of Australia. So it's something that has to be at the forefront of our mind when we're managing operations across the delivery area. Thanks, Paul. The legislative and the social obligation that we have to protect Aboriginal cultural heritage ties in with our environmental stewardship at Melbourne Water. So it all ties back into the foundation of the business, which includes the Heritage Act and then the Planning and Environment Act. It's all we have to treat it as significantly as everything else that we come across, including the environment and historic values across Western Treatment Plant. So it's always at the forefront of our mind, which is great because it's such a significant value. And just a little bit about the historic heritage assets. Paul's touched on these two sites in particular already. The elevated water tank, which is now located at Cockrock, and the main outfall sewer. These sites we also have to manage a lot, as well as Aboriginal cultural heritage, on a day-to-day basis through our operations, but also through legislative operations. Thanks, Paul. And I'll quickly go through the next few slides, so we've got time for questions. There's currently a heritage nomination across the Western Treatment Plant. It's in progress at the moment. Paul spent a lot of time working on that and preparing that. So that's just it's a nomination, obviously, to protect the obvious significant heritage aspects of the site, and it's no doubt that it'll go through. But it just again demonstrates the significant values of Western Treatment Plant, and in particular the Cockrock Township. Thanks, Paul. And I think I'm right on time. That's it.
Yeah.
And I think Karen's going to take back over in a
Okay.
Yeah.
So it'd probably be better if you're looking at Paul. Do you want to come back up, Paul, to answer questions?
Yes.
So that was very interesting. Thank you very much. So if there's one question's come up about what was the website that the material was available on the community life of Cockorock.
The Facebook page.
Yeah, the Facebook page.
What was it called though?
What was it called?
The Faraway Place.
No, Faraway Land of House and Two Cows, I think, or something like that. I've got to look. My presentation our presentation will be made available on PDF on the council website. So I think it's called the Faraway Land of a House and Two Cows. I'm sure it's called off the top of my head.
Okay. Do you want to stop sharing the PowerPoint? And someone's asked, are there many remnants of the houses, schools and pool?
Sorry, what was the question?
Are there many remnants of the houses, schools and pool?
No. So sadly, all the houses have gone. So they were at the time, through Monica's research, we were able to get a few more details, but some were relocated and others, and I think sadly, most of them were pretty much demolished on site. And the school, the only surviving school, as I said, is the I think it was Cockorock North, if I'm not mistaken, and that is today been relocated at College Road, Werribee, which is the Girl Guides Hall.
Okay, and there was another one. Are there any records of the workforce of the early 1900s?
Look, more than likely, not at Melbourne Water. It's not the first time we've been asked, not specifically regarding the Western Treatment Plant, just with the business in general. Those sort of records are probably held at the Public Record Office, I would imagine, and that's where we normally direct people to go.
Okay, thank you. And Wild Ramblings has asked, do you know when the bird watching access will resume?
No, I would imagine there'd be a note on the website, and I believe they have resumed, because I think access is not to the plant, as not even staff can get onto the Western Treatment Plant at the moment. So if I'm not mistaken, I'm sure bird watching has resumed, although it could be an issue in terms of permits. Maybe that's where the question, because I think to get a permit, unless they've gone online, I'm not sure, but normally in the past to get a permit, you would have to actually go into the office, but the office has been shut down. So I would imagine there'd be a note surely on the website. I'll find out. I'll make a note.
Just wanted to touch on the redevelopment going on out at the Western Treatment Works at the moment of the hall, the pool.
Okay, so the status is at the moment. So to add a bit of context, so the Discovery Centre, which was the main administration office on along Old Geelong Road, so that's been sold to council, where we built a new admin office in the heart of the Cockorock Township. So that's finished. The landscaping associated with that is finished, and now the rest of the works, which takes in the farm hall and the pool, the change rooms, pretty much the remnant part of the old township is happening as we speak. There was an initial shutdown with some of the structural works around the farm hall. So the farm hall is being basically refurbished. So the original farm hall survives. The change rooms had dilapidated to a point where it pretty much had to be basically rebuilt to its former form. So stay true to the thing, and the rest will just be landscaped.
I'm really looking forward to seeing that again. So with any sort of luck, we'll be able to run those local history bus tours again in November next year and see the renovations.
Well, yeah, that's right. I mean, bus tours have long been on our calendar, so we're just as keen to resume. As I said at the presentation, at least we've got this opportunity to talk about it and perhaps whet your appetite if you weren't thinking or you weren't aware of the bus tours. So stay tuned in this space.
And Alison just said, I've always wondered if the original sewer pipeline, which the Federation Trail follows, was open, or did the sewerage flow underground along its length?
Predominantly open all the way through. It was just at certain road crossings that pretty much went underground. For the large part, it was open, and I guess the whole thing sort of added to the stigma attached to the Western Treatment Plant in the old days for decades. And so from Pooh Farm, it's become a true gem of the West.
And no longer smelly.
No longer smelly.
We're not Smelbourne anymore.
No.
Okay, so does anybody else have any questions? I think I've caught up with all of them on there. Austin said that Birdline Victoria Facebook page will provide you with updates around bird watching,
Beautiful.
the Western Treatment Plant. And we've also got another event on with Heather Noble, the Werribee River Association tour next week, if people want to check Eventbrite for that. So if there's no more questions, I'd like to thank Paul and Austin for their presentation. And I hope that everybody got lots out of it. I know I certainly did. I learn something new every time I go on one of our bus tours. And this has not been an... Thank you very much.
No. Thank you, guys. Thank you, Karen, Micah, for as I said, making the suggestion to us a few weeks back. So that's great. And thank you, Austin.
Yeah, thanks everyone. Thanks for tuning in.
Yep.
Lots of people have said thank you for the talk in the chat.
No. Thank you, and we look forward to getting back to COVID normal.
Oh, don't we all?
All
okay,
right.
Thank you very much. Well, we might close off at that then.
All right then. So we'll touch base.
Everyone.
Okay.
Okay. Thanks everyone.
Right,
Take
bye-bye.
care.
You all
Thanks,
enjoyed it.
Austin. Thanks, Karen. Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.